Hi everyone, Matt here, welcome back, and today I'm doing a book review of Animal Farm by George Orwell. This is the Everyman's Library edition. The sleeve isn't as eye-catching as perhaps the Penguin Books version, but I think this book has a lot of value. It's not just got the original text by Orwell himself, but it's also got some additional material, letters that Orwell wrote as a preface for the Ukrainian version, and also an unpublished preface as well, which adds a lot of value in my opinion, and provides some historical context around the political notions at the time around sort of the book and how it potentially, well, it does criticise the communist regime, Stalinist Russia. So yeah, overall the book, I first read it in the 2002, I think, at high school. It was part of the curriculum with regards to GCSE English, and it was really the first book that I'd read at school that I really enjoyed and actually could see wider context, and at the time I didn't really appreciate some of the political notions there in terms of how it's a satire on the Soviet Union, and we did investigate those, if I remember correctly, but I've been a sort of student of history for many years now, and I can thoroughly appreciate the ideas and the satirical elements that are inherent within the book. Literally every page has an allusion to events that occurred, and I will be including some spoilers in this review, just because it's sort of necessary given the plot points and how they link into actual historical events. So I regard this book as, it's certainly one of the best books I've ever read, and it immediately goes into my favourites of all time, and that's quite difficult to do. I think that it needs to be paired up with 1984, which I read earlier this year, and they should be seen as companion books, as regarding a commentary on society, and sort of they are ever relevant. They're cautionary tales about power. They are studies of power and what the corruption of ideals and ideologies can have, the impact that it can have on ordinary people like you and me. The story can be enjoyed by younger adults and maybe even children. There's some violence in there, but it can certainly be enjoyed by younger people as purely, a story about animals that want to be free and then, don't end up being free as it happens. But for the more intelligent or advanced, I should say, people that approach this book, the material and the ideas and sort of the complex elements are there if you want to dig deep and figure them out for yourself. So the story concerns a typical English farm that is run by a human being, Mr. Jones, and he treats his animals terribly and doesn't feed them, and it gets to the point where the animals have a discussion with the prize boar, Old Major, who is obviously an allegory towards Lenin, and they plot a revolution. And as time goes by, well, one evening the animals don't get fed because Mr. Jones is drunk. Mr. Jones obviously being an illustration of the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas. And he neglects them one day, and then the animals spring their rebellion earlier than perhaps they wanted to. And eventually they have power, and they've driven all of the humans away. And they take over, and now it's like, what do we do with this power that we've attained? And the pigs, being the most intelligent animals, run things on the farm or do the sort of thinking work that needs to be done. And essentially you see over the course of the book that the power of propaganda and how it can be used to manipulate the easily fooled. And we see this in modern society, especially around current events in the political landscape. And I think people really do need to be aware of, if they haven't approached this book or Orwell's work in particular, of just how powerful the media and the information, how powerful that can be into shaping your worldview. Because it turns out that most of the animals aren't educated enough to see through the fact that they're being manipulated, and if anything, as the story progresses, they're even more controlled and suppressed than they were under Mr. Jones. Then it sort of alludes to the brutal regime of Stalin, with the show trials and the purges, people getting killed, or animals in this case getting killed for crimes that they've been forced to confess to. They're just made up crimes. Stalin, who functions as Napoleon in this book, and how he fosters the secret police, which are the puppies that he snatches away and raises himself to become the sort of fearsome hounds. He's raised them that mirrors the secret police and their sort of reign of terror. And it even goes as far as to investigate Stalin from, like, the Battle of the Windmill is an amalgamation of the Battle of Moscow and the Battle of Stalingrad. Obviously Stalingrad being the most brutal and costly battle in military history, I believe. Orwell went even as far as to change a passage where he states that all animals dove to the ground, if I remember correctly. He changed it to say all animals except Napoleon, because he wanted to acknowledge the fact that Stalin did stay in Moscow, even though the Germans were getting very close. And also the fact that, even a cursory look at the history of World War II and the contribution that the Russians made with 20 million lives, you could argue that actually they wouldn't have won the Eastern Front if it hadn't have been for Stalin, because Stalin, his cult of the personality, was so strong that people actually believed he was sort of a god, and he was akin to a god anyway, from their perspective. And without his sort of influence, they wouldn't have been able to win that battle. And sort of him mobilising a nation, I think that you have to acknowledge that, even though obviously he was a brutal dictator. But it was interesting to see Orwell acknowledge that in the book. It's not often I get annoyed at reading a book, visibly sort of annoyed and frustrated. But every instance during reading this novella, every time the other animals were manipulated or Squealer was, getting around them with rhetoric, it made me really annoyed, because it's so annoying to see liberty being trodden all over, and just that level of manipulation and malice. It was frustrating because it sort of collides with my own ideals and beliefs. So to do that is a great achievement from my perspective. But it's just it's a timeless classic, and it just shows you how power can be corrupted and manipulated, and it's sort of a challenge to the corruption of the communist sort of Marxist-Leninist model that the Soviet Union eventually came to be. So I would certainly urge everyone to read this book. Most people have read it that are interested in books, but it's a must-read, absolutely. I mean, this is the second time I've read it, and it means even more because of my greater historical awareness. So certainly 5 stars from me. You can read my written review on Goodreads, as usual, or on my blog. And as always, thank you for tuning in, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.